In more than 4 decades of visiting the old front line, you can imagine that I've seen a lot of change on that landscape of the Great War. Some of it good, visitor centres which help tell those new to the subject the story of this conflict, the centenary trees in Flanders which mark the front lines of both sides there, but sadly also much of it bad. The loss of trenches and bunkers, mine craters, gun positions, shell-smashed ground, and so much more has disappeared in those decades that I've walked those battlefields of the Great War. When I was on the Somme a couple of weeks ago, I went to look at the changes at Serre in that northern sector of the Somme where the POWs battalions went into action on the 1st of July, and which we've discussed in a recent podcast. There's been long-running issues there with access. A local farmer frustrated by the activities of a minority of visitors often block the way for those who wanted to explore that part of the Somme battlefields. And that's been rolling on for years and years now. But now there's a new parking area by the main Arras road with 2 pathways to what is now a gravel track that goes up that hill towards the battlefield at Serre and the small battlefield cemeteries that you find there. This to me has always been a classic part of the Somme battlefields, not just for the story of those POWs, but the way the cemeteries are so much those beacons of the Great War, marking where the fighting was at its fiercest, and the quiet solitude of the woodland there enables you to think and reflect on what happened more than a century ago. This landscape, with the changes that are there, with new parking areas, with new concrete pathways and the gravel up the hill, it's changed forever now. Not necessarily for the worse, because this will enable people to get to locations that perhaps before they couldn't. But because that landscape means so much to me, I'm just always mindful of these changes. The Sheffield Memorial Park, just beyond the crest of that ridge, tucked into the copses that once marked the front line there in 1916, is always one of those places where you can walk and reflect. And just a few weeks ago, sitting there in the June sunshine, listening to chiff-chaffs in the trees and watching swallows dart over the fields beyond, I reflected on the many, many times I've been there in the past, in a place that felt isolated from the main thoroughfares of the Somme battlefields. And then I walked down through the shell craters to Railway Hollow Cemetery, with a pathway across the fields into a small burial ground dominated by 2 trees, a few ranks of graves, and one, always in that first rank, attracts my attention, the grave of Alf Goodlad of the Sheffield City Battalion. I've stood outside his house in Marshall Avenue at Woodseats in Sheffield. It's quite a large house. Alf's father, William, was an accountant and estate agent, and Alf was his and his wife Jane's only son. Sadly, Alf's mother died just before the Great War in 1913, and standing there that day, I imagined the letters his dad wrote to his boy on active service, which took them to the Suez Canal in Egypt and eventually to France. And one day in March 1916, not long after Alf got to the Western Front, he sent a letter back home to his dad which read, "The French are a grand nation worth fighting for." In the end, I guess Alf and his mates paid that ultimate price so that France could live, survive, thrive and change. And while much remains permanent on that old front line, nothing ever stands still forever. But hopefully around it, the constants of this world make that change have some meaning. And now for this week's questions. Question number 1 comes from Andrew in Gateshead. I've recently discovered the existence of death cards that were given to the families of dead German soldiers in the course of studying my own family history. My question is, how were these cards typically issued, and to whom? I would imagine it was a commanding officer. Most of the ones I've stumbled across also seem to have photographs attached to the soldier in question on them. Where would these be taken from? Were they regimental photos or photos taken from elsewhere? Well, Andrew, these are Sterbebild memorial cards that are very much part of the German culture at the time of the Great War. And indeed, right across Europe, in many European countries, you see these in memoriam cards being given out at funerals, after funerals, by the family of the deceased. So it's not specifically something that directly relates to the military, but of course, the period of the Great War resulted in deaths on an unparalleled scale. And in many of these European countries where this kind of culture was prevalent, thousands of the Sterbebilder in Germany and other places besides were given to remember soldiers who had died at the front. So who issued them? Well, they came really from the families. The families could go to a printer and ask for these to be printed out with, as you've mentioned, photographs. And the photographs that are on them come not from regimental sources or any kind of photograph that was taken when a soldier entered the army, because to my knowledge, not a single combatant nation in the Great War routinely photographed the soldiers who enlisted in their armies. So the photographs come again from the family. So the families would go to a printer, and there were, I know, printers in Germany that specialised in Sterbebild, and they would provide them with a photograph. They would outline the text that would be included in the memorial card. Often it gave some regimental details, the unit they were in, when and where they fell. Sometimes it mentions a region like the Somme or Flanders, sometimes a specific place, and then sometimes the cause of death as well. Killed on the field of battle, died of wounds in a field hospital. I mean, all of these kind of things are often mentioned on these cards. And they give you a kind of snapshot, I guess, quite literally in the case of the photograph of the soldier. It kind of brings that name to life, looking into the face of a man who fell on the battlefields. But it kind of gives you a snapshot of who he was and where he came from. And I found these really interesting to take, research, and then take to the cemeteries where these men are buried. And over the years of picking these up, when I spent a lot of time in Germany in the late 80s and early 90s, in most junk shops there would be a box somewhere in the dampest corner of the premises where there would be loads of photographs from the First and Second World War, and then the Sterbebild from both conflicts, because they were given out again in World War II. And they were much more common in Germany, in the southern part of Germany, because the issuing of these memorial cards is all part of the Catholic culture of southern Germany. It was a region dominated by Roman Catholicism. And what I found was that they would be much more commonly found there than in other parts of Germany, although I found them in Berlin and up on the Baltic coast and all kinds of other places besides. So this was very much kind of part of a way of a German societal way of remembering soldiers who had fallen on the battlefields. And having had these things printed up, the families would then send them out to everyone that might have sent a letter of condolence to them, to family members, sometimes to the press, and also they were given to local priests because, again, in southern Germany, it's not uncommon to walk into a church there and see a frame somewhere on the church wall in which all of the Sterbebild from the local men who died are placed inside it, and it acts as its own kind of war memorial. So you can look to one part of the church and see the long list of names of the fallen, and then in another frame are photographs of them that are on the Sterbebild. So using these documents as kind of one of those layers of the First World War, as I say, I often research them and then take them to the cemeteries where these men are buried. So I have examples for some of the bigger and more famous German cemeteries, from Langemark to Menin to La Targette, but many, many others besides. And it's surprising, beyond the British sector of the Western Front, as you head down towards that kind of central part of eastern France, towards Alsace-Lorraine, there are a huge number of German cemeteries in that area. Some of them were constructed on what during the Great War was actually German soil, because Alsace-Lorraine, of course, had been annexed after the Franco-Prussian War. So it's kind of another way, I think, to give us insights into the First World War by using these Sterbebilder as contemporary documents, as archival documents, to tell us more about that generation of young Germans who fought in the Great War, and bringing the names that we see in what people often describe as dark and foreboding cemeteries, but it brings those names to light. And if you're curious to see some or pick some up, just go on an auction site like eBay and you'll find loads of them on there, and people selling CDs with scanned Sterbebild on, with hundreds if not thousands on the CD, which you can then download and print off. And they're really interesting to take to show groups or show friends when you're visiting these battlefield sites, because again, it kind of personalizes the story. And the German side, as we've often said on this podcast, is not discussed enough. So the Sterbebild are a way to, I think, supplement what we know, and it gives an incredible insight into loss. So this kind of memorial card is not unique to Germany, as we've said, but it's much less common, for example, on the other side of the battlefield, with British soldiers. You don't tend to see a uniform kind of approach to producing memorial cards for British soldiers who fell in the Great War. I mean, I have examples of these, and I see them quite regularly. They kind of follow a similar theme. A card with a black edge to symbolise that it's a mourning card, and we would probably describe them as mourning cards rather than in memoriam cards, but there are quite a few variations of them, and I've got quite a few of those different types in my collection, from cards that just say a name and some basic details about a soldier, through to ones that do include photographs, ones which are printed extracts from newspaper articles, or a photograph of the soldier with a name underneath, with some other details on the back of the card. I mean, there's lots of different variations. What I've found is more common in Britain, though, are in memoriam bookmarks, something that I haven't seen a lot of, for example, in Germany. And these are literally just that, like a bookmark, often in silk, frequently with a photograph of the soldier on there, and then some details. And it's my understanding that these were given out, again, to family members and friends of the family who sent condolences in, so that they could put them in their family Bible and mark a page perhaps for that soldier with an appropriate reading. It was all more part of that Christian kind of culture that existed in Britain before the Great War. And I think these kind of things really do, as I say, give us so much insight into how families marked the loss of someone on the battlefields and remembered them, what form they remembered. And for ordinary working class people, this marks a much more affordable way to memorialise somebody compared to someone who had the money to put a plaque on the wall of a church, fund a war memorial for the local village, build a church tower. I mean, there's so many other examples of that. But it's certainly all part of that culture of loss that we see emerge on such a massive, massive scale from the period of the Great War. Question number 2 comes from Greg in Wisconsin. My question is, how much did the flu pandemic factor into the decline of the German army's effectiveness in 1918? The amount of casualties, combined with the increase in sick combatants and support personnel through 1918, must have had an impact on the German military, and all other nations' militaries for that matter, resulting in a final move towards the armistice. Well, this is a really interesting question, Greg, because first of all, what was the flu pandemic? Well, Spanish flu, influenza, began to sweep across Europe from the spring of 1918 in its first wave through to peaks later on in 1918 and on into 1919. It was a world pandemic, something we've experienced in our own lifetimes quite recently, that spread right across the world, and millions of people died as a consequence of it, more in places like Southeast Asia than in Europe, but although in Europe the casualties were not insignificant as well. And there's been much debate over the years as to how this started, particularly in terms of the European context. It was thought that troops, perhaps from the Chinese Labour Corps, had brought it into France, or perhaps those from Vietnam or Indochina as it was known then. Perhaps they had brought it in, serving with the French army. But some years ago, I made a documentary about a casualty of the Great War who died from influenza, having joined up right at the beginning of the Great War, served on the Western Front from 1915, was never wounded, decorated for gallantry, and wrote home on Armistice Day to his family and recorded the fact that the war had come to an end and he would be home soon. And then within a few days, he contracted influenza and he died. And as part of that program, we interviewed a bacteriologist, Professor Oxford from Oxford, who came over to speak to the presenter of the program to explain influenza. And he'd been doing a lot of research on this, and he thought that the explanation for how it started within Europe was not that men brought it into Europe, but that the base camp at Etaples was on the migration route of birds that came from Southeast Asia, and that their feces perhaps dropping into the camp, that was how it was spread there. So patient zero, as it were, in Europe at that time for influenza perhaps emanated from the infantry base depot at Etaples. I mean, I'm sure, just like historians arguing over the Great War, bacteriologists will be arguing over the cause of this for many centuries to come. But in terms of the first cases that were noted, these begin to appear in the British Expeditionary Force in April and May of 1918. Consider that kind of first wave of influenza. And then there were later waves in October and November of 1918. So what were the casualties in those battlefield areas where nations of all sides were fighting in 1918? Well, from a British perspective, it's estimated that over 310,000 soldiers contracted influenza. In the American Expeditionary Force, it was over 340,000. And on the German side, which you ask about, it was over 400,000, although some accounts claim that could be well over 700,000 German soldiers who contracted it. Now, of course, that would have put a strain on medical resources, treating these men, trying to come to terms with a new disease, what was causing it, what could be the treatment for it, how do you explain men dying from it. Science was finding that it was having to catch up very quickly on the outcomes of people contracting this disease and what it would do to them. And as experience showed, moving from the first wave into the second waves in that autumn of 1918, it didn't mean that everybody died from it, for example. So if we add up all those figures, it's well over 1 million combatants that are suffering from influenza. I don't have the figures for the French, but I would guess that it would be something similar. So it could be much more like 1.5 million soldiers contract influenza sometime in that period from the second half of 1918 on into early 1919, but they didn't all die. The Americans have the highest mortality rate with over 45,000 dead from it. So it's clear that it must have affected the military prowess of any nation on the battlefield at that time, because they found themselves treating casualties, far more casualties than they expected, and not combat casualties, because men could show symptoms of this no matter what time that they were serving, whether they were out of the trenches, in the trenches, or whatever. So looking at whether this affected the ability of Germany to continue to fight in late 1918, let's kind of consider the state of the German army at this stage. Now, Germany had brought over huge numbers of men from the Eastern Front following the signing of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty in February 1918, which effectively ended the war on the Eastern Front and enabled them to bring over those troops to launch that series of offensives on the Western Front from the Somme in March through to Flanders in April and the Chemin des Dames in May, and then the continuation of that fight around Paris in the Second Battle of the Marne in that early summer period of 1918. And that cost the German army huge casualties. On the Somme alone, they were suffering tens of thousands of casualties a day in March 1918, pushing the lines forward, overrunning the British and the French positions. It came at a massive cost, and a huge number of those men that were brought from the Eastern Front found their graves on the Somme or Flanders or the Chemin des Dames or the Marne, and the whole nature of the German army during that spring through to summer and on into the early autumn of 1918 began to change as a consequence of those battlefield casualties. And they began to call up more and more young men, including those who were underage, calling them up early effectively to fill the ranks of the German army. And influenza, as you can imagine, made this only worse. So you can imagine that it did have some effect on the outcome of what was happening. But more than that, the submarine blockade of Germany was starving Germany. I think this was perhaps more important because it affected everyone in the nation, not just those hundreds of thousands of soldiers contracting influenza, but this affected everybody. People were starving at home and soldiers were starving in the field. I've often told that story of British veterans who had served in this period of the war. When they captured German soldiers, the first thing they would do is pop their hands up and say, "Kamerad, Fleisch bitte," and they'd be after tins of bully beef because they'd not eaten proper meat, if bully was proper meat, but they'd not eaten proper meat for quite some time. So I think that had just as much, if not more, of an effect on the outcome of what happened to the German armed forces. And I think that if you look at all these kind of factors together, influenza is one of those factors, but we can't underestimate what led to German defeat, and that was Allied prowess on the Western Front. The British and the French and the American armies, Allied coalition forces fighting together side by side, rupturing the German line on the Western Front, beating its forces in the field, destroying its ability to continue to fight, and pushing it back to a point where, if that continues, those Allied forces are going to be on German soil. And that led to the armistice to bring that war to an end, I guess, before that happened. So influenza, a critical part of our understanding of that latter part of the Great War, particularly on the Western Front in September, October, November of 1918. It caused huge casualties and would continue to cause casualties beyond the end of the war, but it didn't bring about an end to that conflict on the Western Front. Question number 3 comes from Russell via email. Where did the names Pip, Squeak and Wilfred come from to name the 1914-15 Star British War and Victory Medals? Well, that phrase for what is often called the trio of First World War medals, the 1914 or the 1914-15 Star and the British War and Victory Medals, many veterans referred to that trio of medals as Pip, Squeak and Wilfred. And Pip, Squeak and Wilfred were part of a cartoon strip in the Daily Mirror, which ran from 1919, so just after the war, up until 1956. And it featured and followed an orphaned animal family. Pip, the father, was a loyal dog, Squeak, the mother, was a penguin, and Wilfred, the young son, was a small rabbit with very long ears. And the cartoon was the brainchild of Bertram J. Lamb and drawn for him by Austin Bowen Payne, and it was hugely popular and resulted in books and annuals and was known by just about everybody. And it led to that generation of Great War veterans with the trio naming their medals after these characters. I don't know specifically why, but it just came into common usage that the medals would be referred to as Pip, Squeak and Wilfred. And those 3 medals, not just the 1914-15 Star that you mentioned, but the 1914 Star, which to the untrained eye, both those stars look very similar. It's only once you look at them closely that you can see the difference in them. So the 1914 Star has the year 1914 in the centre of the medal, with August to November above and below it, signifying the fact that the medal, the 1914 Star, often called the Mons Star, was given to servicemen who served in France and Flanders from the 5th of August to the 22nd of November 1914. So it was specifically for service on the Western Front, France and Flanders, and specifically within those date parameters, because the first British troops arrived in France on the 5th of August, the day after war broke out, and the 22nd of November 1914 was a period selected that saw the tail end of the First Battle of Ypres. And while it was called the Mons Star, most men awarded the 1914 star did not serve at Mons. Most of them served in that First Battle of Ypres in October and November of 1914. The 1914-15 star was awarded to all servicemen of all branches of service who did not qualify for the 1914 star. So the Navy, if you're on a ship at sea in the North Sea or going off to the South Atlantic, you didn't qualify for the 1914 star, but you qualified for the 1914-15 star because it was issued to men who served overseas in all theatres of war who didn't qualify for that first medal from the beginning of the war through to the 31st of December 1915. The vast majority of men who got it served on the Western Front, but it was also for men who served in Salonika, Gallipoli, and many other theatres of war as well. You couldn't get both medals, so you couldn't have the 1914 and the 1914-15 star. And before you write in, yes, I know there are examples of men being erroneously issued both medals, but in theory you couldn't get both. And what went with them was the British War and Victory medals. The British War medal was a silver medal with a symbol of defeat of Germany on one side and the dates 1914-18. That symbolised the beginning and the end of the actual conflict itself, with the armistice and other treaties bringing the actual fighting to a close. But the Victory Medal has the dates 1914-19 on it because that commemorates the final victory, which was sealed in the Treaty of Versailles of 1919. All of these medals are named, the stars on the back of the medal and the British War and Victory Medal on the rim of those medals. And many of you listening to this will probably have examples of them in your collection, or you'll have your own family members' medals. And they are incredibly evocative artifacts, I think, items that connect us to individual soldiers who fought in the Great War and sadly often died in the Great War as well. And when I used to trawl all those fantastic junk shops in Sussex and many other places besides back in the 80s and 90s, they were full of medals like this, just discarded. They were in seed trays and jars and tins and boxes, and you go in there and groups would be split up, and it was a very different kind of world. The generation of the Great War sadly was forgotten then. They're not as cheap today, but they're very easy to get hold of again on auction sites, and if you don't have any First World War medals, it is quite a nice way to connect to an individual who was there in the Great War. Now, Pipsqueak and Wilfrid is the name given to the trio, but perhaps lesser known is the name that was given to those servicemen who just got the British War and Victory Medal, because not everybody got a trio. Not everyone served in 1914, and not everyone served in 1914 and 15. So if you were a conscript who was conscripted in 1916, 17, 18, and you served in that second half of the Great War and went overseas, then you would get the British War and Victory Medal, just the two medals, again, named on the rim. And the common usage name for those, Pipsqueak and Wilfrid for the trio, and for the pair, Mutt and Jeff. These were two characters from a long-running American cartoon series dating back to before the Great War, to 1907, and was very popular in the UK during that Great War period in a lot of the newspapers. So it was characters that people knew of, and I guess following the adoption of the phrase Pipsqueak and Wilfrid, then the men who didn't have a Pipsqueak and Wilfrid wanted a name for their medals, and they called them Mutt and Jeff. And I remember many of the veterans that I interviewed felt a bit cheated by just having the two medals. Some of the men who I spoke to who were in the Sheffield City Battalion, for example, we mentioned Alf Goodlad at the beginning of this podcast, they went to the Suez Canal, but they just missed out in 1915 on the 1914-15 star because of their date of arrival in Egypt. Other units in the same division, that 31st Division, got there before midnight on the 31st of December 1915, so did get the star, but the Sheffield City Battalion, the vast majority of men in that unit, did not get there in time, so subsequently after the war, they received just the two medals. And I say just the two medals, when I think of characters like Reg Glenn, who I interviewed, who went right through the war, he served 2 years nearly on the Western Front. So just those two medals could really indicate a very, very long period of service, which is why they'd looked at putting battle bars on the medals to indicate where men had served, but that was too expensive. And it's a subject actually that we've touched on before when someone asked a question about those battle bars, and you'll find that in one of the previous Q&As. But medals have often had these nicknames. Back in the Victorian period, the Long Service Medal that was given to soldiers who served for a very long period in the British Army that would enable them to claim a pension after that service was over. It was called the Rooty Medal. Rooty was a corruption of an Indian word meaning bread, and it meant that if you got that medal, then you were going to get bread, a pension for the rest of your life. In the Navy, the Long Service Medal was called the Blue Peter. But I found interviewing those veterans of the Great War and then spending many, many years of my life with that generation of the Second World War as well, I was often surprised how casually they regarded the medals that they had. Malcolm Vivian, I think I've told this story before on the podcast, didn't even know that his medals had his name on. He'd never really looked at them closely. And a few of the veterans that I interviewed had their medals still in the original boxes, in the original envelopes, just tucked in the back of a drawer. They'd never mounted them for wear. They'd never worn them. They never displayed the fact that they were a veteran. They thought everyone of my generation took part in this one way or another. What makes me special, despite the fact that many of those who thought that way and had never worn their medals had done the most incredible things that we would look at and just our minds would boggle at the kind of experiences that they had. So I guess it was a different kind of philosophy, and perhaps naming medals after cartoon characters gives as well, I think, a bit of an insight as to how soldiers saw these medals. And I think it's one of the books by Henry Williamson where he recounts going to an armistice commemoration and one of the local councillors is stood there with medals, and everyone knows that he spent the war at the base filling sandbags or doing some menial task. I mean, obviously his job was important to the overall war effort, but the veterans who'd been in the trenches and gone over the top and experienced all those things that frontline soldiers experience looked at someone like him with his chest pushed out and his medals glinting in the morning sunshine. What value is there to medals like that if they can be awarded to him, as well as those who would be awarded the same medals, of course, who had seen that darkest point, that darkest moment of the Great War on the front line, on the Western Front, Gallipoli, Palestine, Mesopotamia, Salonika, wherever it was. Our fourth and final question comes from Steve Goodall. It's well known that the Great War is synonymous with trench warfare, with the distance across no man's land varying from as little as 10 metres to hundreds of metres. I remember a documentary by Peter Barton, for example, where he mentioned that the trenches at Bois Français were so close that the Allies could smell the Germans cooking their sausages. In locations like this, where at surface level they would have been in clear sight of the enemy, how did they start digging their trenches without being shot or shelled by the opposing side? Well, I mean, I think the kind of central part of your question there, how did they dig when they were essentially facing each other and exposed to the enemy? It's amazing how quickly a soldier can dig when he comes under fire from the enemy. And if we go back to the kind of formation of trenches, those trenches were not there before the Great War. No one had laid out these fortifications ready for someone to occupy. And when that mobile war of 1914 suddenly deadlocked and went static, both sides had to rapidly dig in. And men were digging quickly with their entrenching tools or whatever equipment they carried with them on the battlefield, a shallow shell scrape, if you like, to protect them in a very small way initially from enemy fire. Then as soon as it got dark, they would work on that again, make it deeper, connect their shell scrape up with their comrades, one on the right and another one on the left, and gradually that infrastructure of the positions would develop. And while no one had imagined trench warfare on this kind of scale, if you look at the manuals, military manuals of armies that went to war in 1914, all of them had trained their soldiers to dig fortifications. so men were prepared and knew how to do it. So on the Aisne in September 1914, as the Germans pulled back following the Battle of the Marne, they moved to the Aisne Heights, began to dig in there. The British and the French dug in opposite, and the very first trenches were created. And some of those very first British trenches above the village of Soupir are still essentially there to this day. Later worked upon by the French, expanded, that whole position was expanded by the French once they took over following the departure of the British. But nevertheless, where those first British trenches were marked on hand-drawn maps by officers of the King's Royal Rifle Corps, for example, you can walk into that wooded area above Soupir, and that trench system is there as laid out on that map. So initially, almost by a kind of mutual consent, both sides dig in. But it's the expansion of that over the course of the next weeks and months and eventually, of course, years that changes that battlefield landscape to become this vast siege stretching along those 450 miles. And once it was commonplace for both sides to dig in, improve, and then work on their positions constantly, both sides then harassed each other while they were doing that. Send over shrapnel, send over explosive, randomly fire rifles and machine guns towards areas where they knew men were working, eventually send gas, all kinds of weapons. So just working on your positions could result in casualties. And if you look at any war diary of any unit that served on the Western Front, you will find evidence of that. Now, you mentioned the trench system at Bois Français. Bois Français was a wooded area above the village of Fricourt, close to Mametz as well, an area where Robert Graves served and Siegfried Sassoon served in the latter part of 1915 with the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, for example, and Bernard Adams, who wrote Nothing of Importance, fantastic memoir of the Great War, covers that area as well. It's an area where both sides, the French and the Germans, had met in 1914, dug in, facing each other on the crest of that ridge, gone underground, blown mines, and those craters were now separating all that separated both sides' trenches. The British inherited that, did their own mining activities up there, and you can see evidence of that today. If you go into the woods there, they are private property. There are some paths through some bits of it. Do take care, because there is a shooting area up there now, a bull trap, clay pigeon shooting, so you've got to be careful of that. But the mine craters are up there, some of the trenches are up there. You can see how close together they were, and as you say, close enough to smell the sausages cooking, to hear the conversations of the enemy, and almost to shout across to each other. And that kind of thing did happen, but it's not the only part of the Western Front where lines were that close. Today we can go to places like Vimy Ridge, where the Canadian Memorial Park is at Vimy Ridge, and we can look at that battlefield not from the Canadian perspective of the attack there in April 1917 and the victory at Vimy Ridge, but the years preceding that, when largely British troops were there occupying those trenches, and the Germans were blowing mines, and the British tunnellers were blowing mines, and the French miners before them. And across that ridge, which we see in the Canadian Memorial Park today, are similar mine craters to the Bois Français, which separate the two sets of trenches. And you can very, very visibly see there how close, almost on top of each other, both sides were living, existing, and fighting. It's one of the most curious aspects, I think, of the Great War, that troglodyte world of the Great War, where men were living in these ditches, these open ditches across the European landscape, and often so close to each other, with thousands and thousands of men in fairly small areas, not just in the front line, but in that whole kind of infrastructure of the battlefield, from the front line to the support line to the reserve line, in the communication trenches, and all the saps that were there, the tunnels underneath. The whole thing. It's just extraordinary. A war without parallel in terms of that kind of experience, and the closeness of the protagonists being literally so close to each other made many of the veterans that I interviewed reflect on that, because many of them had not even seen a German, but there they were, living almost on top of them, but both sides unseen, because to be seen meant death. And that was the nature of that cruel troglodyte world of the Great War. So that's the last of our questions for this episode. As always, I hope you found the answers of interest. Keep the questions coming via the usual methods of email or the Discord server and a few others besides. And we'll see you again soon for some more questions and answers here on the Old Front Line. You've been listening to an episode of the Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.